you don't play the game with a reasonable technique of like actually holding your breath a bit and squeezing the trigger, it's hard to hit those long shots. It does matter.
Sniper Elite VR, coming next week, is a really interesting exercise in balancing VR authenticity and accessibility. We sat down with Rebellion's Steve Bristow to talk about straddling that line. Just as an overview, how is VR changing the Sniper Elite experience?
What VR adds to the existing sort of mechanics and story of Sniper Elite is a much greater sense of actually being there. You know that thing that you get with like war photographers. You ask a war photographer how they can do what they do, and it's because they're able to sort of compartmentalize their view of the world through the lens, and they're sort of looking through the viewfinder, and it detaches them from the scene. And I think that sort of happens to a certain extent with a sniper game as well. You know, you sort of look at yourself slightly differently, or you place yourself differently in the scene. And I think the VR experience of sniping really, for me at any rate, really clarified that I'm there in the scene, I'm a part of the scene rather than just watching it through a window. And then I raise my scope and I'm getting that kind of viewfinder view of the world, which is at once sort of visceral and powerful and also somehow sort of emotionally detached from it at the same time. That's really what the kill cam is all about. Punctuating that with the restoration of the sort of like the real of it, like the actual impact of the shot. So I think like that's come across really, really well with Sniper Elite VR, putting the player in the scene, like, you know, really part of the action, like most VR games do so well. I think that's different for me from the other sniper games.
Why did you go for the whole Sniper Elite VR, well, the whole Sniper Elite experience in the VR game? Why not just focus on the sniping for this one? Because that's obviously, when you hear that Sniper Elite is coming to VR, you immediately think, oh yeah, sitting there with that rifle is going to be a great in-depth experience. But then you've got all the other elements that you would expect from the usual games in the series too. Why did you put those in?
It's about manipulating the flow and pace of the game. You know, you do that if you do the same thing over and over and over again in any context, whatever it might be, it can get kind of, you know, you can kind of get used to it, and its impact is lost a little bit. So this is a form of seasoning where there are levels where you kind of work your way towards a sniping section, and then you're that powerful sniper again. But then you've got to kind of expose yourself to a different kind of risk and to give you different problems to solve and to sort of tackle that in a different kind of way. And it really helps to create this sort of ebb and flow of intensity. The cool thing about being a sniper, or the great thing, and especially if you're up in some sort of position of power over the level, is you feel untouchable, and that's cool for a while. But eventually, you're like, you know, you want to change that up a little bit and get down and experience something different. So you know, it's all about different notes on the keyboard, like different kind of gameplay flavors that we can mix together to create something that stays fresh as you move through the levels and sort of.
Something that has to have changed quite a lot, obviously, with this entry is the weapon handling, and you know, obviously on a controller you have, you know, your established norms of how you're going to control any gun in any game. Here you've got something that's, you know, of a certain time, a certain period, and you've got all these kind of authentic reload mechanisms. You've got ballistics, I think it is, at when you're choosing the difficulties. That seems like it must have maybe been like the hardest or the most new thing to work on here.
You know, when you're designing a game, early on you try to get to a point where in your imagination you're playing it, and I'd used the aim controller on the PSVR for the first time, and so straight away that's kind of like, well, this is great. This feels really natural and organic, and I straight away know how I want the scope to work. This has got to be a natural, realistic scope that I put my eye to. I don't want to try to use any kind of artifice to create a scope like view to begin with, because of the aim controller. But what the aim controller lacked that the hand controllers have is the next part of that, which is all the sort of mechanical interactions, like sliding the bolt and, you know, that the sort of the role play of it, like the physical action of using the rifle, which is a cool sensation. I remember playing like Robo Recall, and like the first time I played that, just being completely blown away by just how cool I felt, just like whipping a shotgun out over my shoulder and stuff. And indeed, anybody that plays Sniper Elite VR will perhaps recognise that moment in our interpretation of how the infantry works. It comes with kind of complexity for the user, which is that you do actually have to be quite good at actual shooting. The accuracy of your shot is really key to this. Like, you know when you pull the trigger if you've missed or if you've hit. So that means we can't really sort of cheat with where the bullet goes. If you line the crosshairs up and you know that you've shot past the guy's ear, you'll feel cheated if that doesn't happen. In the same way that if you know you've got the shot between his eyes and it misses, that doesn't feel great. But the flip side, the issue with that is if you don't play the game in a sort of like with a reasonable technique of like actually holding your breath a bit and squeezing the trigger, it's hard to hit those long shots. It does matter. There's a good reason that if you're trained to fire a rifle, there's a technique that makes a difference, and those techniques to a certain extent apply with this game. So there's a degree of sort of physical authenticity about this game that you just can't get through a controller.
When the project started out, were there things that you assumed that VR would kind of help you do more so than you've ever done before? So like that authentic reloading.
I think I would describe the sort of the general position of the Sniper Elite games as games that make you feel like an elite sniper without actually demanding 18 months of sniper training to get any good at, right? So there are assists in those games, but the overall sensation of pulling off a really long shot is the culmination of a lot of good judgment, good timing. So that's sort of where I was going. I want to get that first. As you'll have noticed, we do take some liberties. Things like the reloading is somewhat simplified, because in reality, if I insisted that you kind of inserted this clip correctly into the top and pushed it down before actioning the bolt, and insisted that you closed the bolt properly without sort of snapping it shut for you, you would end up in frustrating situations far too often for it to be fun. And it would, and that kind of inevitable imprecision that comes from a sort of a motion control where you don't physically feel the resistance of the thing you're actioning with, results in an impossible gap to close for the player. And so, to begin with, when we had a kind of almost, let's call it a completely mechanically authentic process for the reload, we were like, I was dropping bullets the whole time and thinking that I'd reloaded the rifle and lifting it and not firing because it wasn't properly reloaded. So yes, we kind of started with a more of a leaning towards making this mechanically work, and then we added support for the gap between the players' understanding of how that works and the limitations of a motion control system where you're unable to use your sense of touch to determine how well you've done your reload or how complete the action is. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
When we've got like gloves in VR with haptics in that can sort of indicate to me that I've reached the end of the bolt slide or whatever it might be, then I might go back and look at that kind of thing again. But like as with any motion control system, we're relying on gestures rather than precise controls a lot of the time. So we have to interpret those gestures. Mm. But one of the things that's difficult to do in a VR game, or at any rate difficult to successfully do in a VR game, is to use the heads-up display that you would normally rely on heavily in a stealth game to communicate statuses to the player. You'll have seen like the awareness radius thing over the enemies. I would very much rather that we didn't have to sort of lean on those kind of techniques. I would like a more sophisticated version of that for some future version of this. But in practice, if you go for a completely naturalistic approach to that, like somebody turns around and just goes, huh, and then you have to kind of guess whether or not they've spotted you, that gets really frustrating really quickly. There is a sort of you have to kind of abstract the systems of stealth a little bit to make it work in gameplay terms, I think. And I don't think that's any different with VR. One of the other odd things about VR as well is that whereas you would rely a lot on sort of off-screen indicators to show you the position of enemies and so on, that just really does not work very well in VR. I mean, we actually have off-screen indicators for things like the objectives on that, and it's frequently, you have to look around for where the objective is a lot of the time, because if it's around the edge of your vision, it's just really hard to get the player to reliably draw their attention to it. Unless it's right in the center of your view, you tend to look past it. You sort of see through it, which is a strength, but also an issue from a sort of design point of view. There are you can turn all of this stuff off. You can strip out all of the HUD if you want to. There are a number of options for the player to sort of tune the experience to what they want. But with that, with the HUD prevalence at the normal or high level, there are artificial conceits in the game, like the ammo counters. You sort of tip the gun up to read the ammo or to see the mastery status of the weapon. So they all work quite well, and I think we've done a good job of finding discrete ways to incorporate them in without making the game look artificial at a glance.
I really like the approach that you have of between missions going back to present day and kind of like getting to see what you fought for in a sense. So I wondered if both that and then the setting that you chose, this part of World War II that you chose for this game, were they specific to VR? Like, would you have done that a different way if this was a flat screen game?
In Sniper Elite VR, and maybe VR in general, but I felt like I want the character to sit back a little bit and let me be in the story. And so our character is known as the partisan to the extent that he's known to the player at all. He's a kind of an archetype of a story, but I want the player to be in no. I want them to be that character. I want this to be about me when I'm playing it. It's certainly different, and no, I wouldn't necessarily do the same thing if we were doing a new flat sniper game, because I think that that comes with different strengths and weaknesses. This was really about exploiting one of the great strengths of VR from my point of view. So much of VR development is learning still. We don't begin yet. We don't begin with a template for a VR game. They're starting to form, but when we first started work on Battlezone, I spent a few months designing that game without having ever had to put a headset on. And so that revelatory moment of finally getting into VR and going, well, that was a waste of 3 months. I'm going to have to start completely all over again. All of my assumptions about this were wrong. That still kind of goes on to some extent. You can imagine, you sort of mentally simulate how you think the game's going to feel, and then you put it in action, and it's like, no, we need to change this. So that, particularly around things like player interactions and the systems that we use for that, they require a lot of iteration to get them to work well. And that still takes up a big chunk of the development time, and ultimately, like it or not, there is a finite amount of person power that goes into these things, and a lot of it is still in the R&D part to refine the systems that if we were starting a flat game, you would already know what you were going to do and how you were going to solve it. I can't wait to move on to the next one, because this is, if that ever happens, because we've learned so much in the development of this, to be able to start from a more solid footing and then exploit the other areas of the game, the other systems and mechanics of the game, is really a really exciting idea. But it's also really fun. That's the flip side of this is it's kind of what you get into the industry. It's what I got into the industry to do, is to sort of help to establish the kind of the forms and language of design, because in many respects it is new in VR, different. But that is a work in progress for sure.